Earlier this month, Portland State University philosophy professor Peter Boghossian resigned from his position. He made his resignation letter public on journalist Barry Weiss's Substack blog. In his letter, titled "My University Sacrificed Ideas for Ideology, so Today I Quit," Boghossian claims that after becoming known as a critic of the dominant ways of thinking about race, gender, and sexuality, his university retaliated against him. I'm Mike Mazza, Junior Fellow and Instructor here at ARI. Joining me today to discuss the Boghossian story are ARI Senior Fellow Onkar Ghate, and for the first time on New Ideal Live, Nikos Sotirakopoulos, author of the recent book, Identity Politics and Tribalism, The New Culture Wars, Senior Lecturer in Social Sciences at York St. John University, and Director of ARI Europe. Hi, Onkar. Hi, Nikos. Thanks for joining me.
Hello.
So Boghossian became known to the broader public in 2017, 2018, when he, with his collaborators Helen, Pluckrose, and James Lindsay, published a series of hoax articles in prominent journals focused on issues of race, gender, sexuality. Boghossian's claim in his resignation letter is that it's really these hoax articles that started the backlash against him at Portland State. He was initially subject to some sort of research misconduct investigations on the grounds that the hoax journal editors were human subjects in an unsanctioned experiment. He alleges also that a lot of bizarre behavior on the part of students. He would be spit on as he walked to class. A student accused him of physically abusing his family, and the university took this seriously, investigated him, interviewed people, asking them whether or not they knew about Boghossian abusing his family. Students smeared feces on his office door. The university declined to investigate that. They investigated the unfounded accusations against him, but not this. And colleagues began asking or advising students not to take his classes. So we're talking about this Boghossian episode in part because we're interested in what the climate on contemporary campuses are and how they got this way. So Nikos, I want to start with you, since of the three of us, you're the one still actually on a college campus. What do you make of this behavior that Boghossian was subjected to? Do you think that he seems to think that this kind of behavior is new or has gotten worse in recent years? Do you have any thoughts?
So look, the universities have for a long time been mostly dominating that ideas that are, let's say, leaning towards the left. But what has changed, and Boghossian gives mainly two reasons for his alienation, let's say, for his disillusionment. The one is, as you said, this behavior, the attacks, the personal attacks on him. But the second reason he's giving is he says, I cannot teach anymore in the way I enjoy teaching, which is, let's say, teaching students to pursue the truth. And where he's going with that is that the universities more and more are in a way institutionalizing that their mission is not necessarily the truth, but it's something else. It is social justice, or it is for the research to have an impact, which means that their research or their teaching is a tool for something else, and not necessarily for the pursuit of knowledge. So from all the things that Boghossian said, this is the one that in a way, I found more familiar with my experience in academia, that more and more we're encouraged, particularly in the UK, where your funding is based on public funding bodies, that your work, in a way, your research and your teaching has to benefit, let's say, disadvantaged groups and has to promote social justice. Now, you could say that there's nothing that you could say, yeah, well, if I'm teaching the truth, this promotes justice indeed. But as Boghossian says, the way we understand social justice is under a very particular ideological prism, and this makes the atmosphere ideologically, let's say, suffocating.
So this idea that Boghossian seems to have, that there's an ideological monoculture on campus, and that this is part of what's new. Now, that doesn't ring exactly right to me. Onkar, do you have any insight into this? There's been monocultures on college campuses before. Everybody's a Marxist, everybody's a radical leftist. What's changed since, say, the old, from the old left to the new left, and the new left to the newest left? What's different now?
So you asked, or you said that Nikos he's still on college campus. So I was on college campuses in the 80s and 90s doing my undergraduate and then graduate degrees. I would describe both. So I was in Canada. I would describe both places I was at, University of Toronto, University of Calgary, as close to a monoculture when we're talking particularly about social and political values. So not that in when we're talking, I did economics and philosophy, that every economist on the faculty, every philosopher agreed about everything, but there was widespread agreement on political and social issues, and a real ostracizing of anyone who didn't toe the line. I remember I was on campus, for instance, in the first Gulf War, and anyone who wasn't outraged by the war was ostracized. And I could see that even with faculty, that if they just raised, philosophy faculty just raised some question like, you sure that the war is completely wrong and so on, they were attacked. And we'll talk about deplatforming and things like that. This happened in the 80s and the 90s, people talking about environmentalism and challenging it's now kind of unchallengeable. And we don't even think of it as really anybody would challenge it, but it was challenged in the 80s and 90s that we need more industry, not less, for instance. And people were booed off the stage, not allowed to speak. So you could see this coming in the 80s and I think before that. If you read, for instance, Ayn Rand's view of the universities in the 60s and 70s, her view is not that they're not a monoculture. They're saturated with one ideological viewpoint, which means a certain viewpoint of social and political issues. I think it's gotten worse, and particularly it's more hooligan now, even more. There were elements of it all the way back to the 60s, but to say we're in a more tribal age is to say that people's opposition is less in terms of giving arguments and saying, no, we can't hear this view for reasons A, B, C, and D. It's just, we can't hear this view, period. And that is like you're lower intellectually. And as a result, it's just more hooligan, and it has that atmosphere. And we've seen it seep out of the universities now, and that also that it's more widespread now. People think of it as, I think rightly, as it's all over the place.
Yeah, that sounds right to me. So Boghossian, in his resignation letter, and we also, as part of preparation for this podcast, listened to a podcast he did with Barry Weiss about the resignation letter, which is interesting and worth listening to. He points the finger at what he calls grievance studies as the cause of this accelerating hooliganism, if you want to put it that way. I think we should say a few things about what exactly grievance studies is supposed to be. I know it's Nikos, you seem to, in prior conversation, have a discomfort with the use of the term grievance studies. So how do you understand these ideas? Do you think of them in terms of grievances? Do you think of them some other way?
So the problem with the term grievance studies is that it indicates that the problem is that they bring up grievances, whereas my issue with them is what is the method through which you find these grievances. So let me explain what I mean. So if you take, for example, critical theory, which is a term that is used a lot about this field. So the point of critical theory is to teach you, and in a way it's a practice, it's a method through which it's a training on how to spot injustices that someone else would not be able to spot. It's a bit similar to what people on the right call the red pill. So critical theory, you put on these glasses and you see these injustices where other people can't see them. And the only people who could see them are people who have the, quote, lived experience of this injustice. So if you think about it, it basically tells you that your mind and what you see is not the world as it is. It is the world as you're trained to see it. But they don't tell you that what you see is, let's say, wrong, and there is something else, another way of viewing it, which is right. It is telling you that based on which group you are part of, this is how you see the world. So, for example, if we see KKK burning crosses, every rational person would say, okay, this is clearly racism. But critical theory is going to tell you that even an interaction where you wouldn't even experience it as unpleasant, for example, someone saying something or you replying in a particular way, and 10 rational people will say, yeah, okay, nothing happened here. Critical theories tell you, no, something happened, but either you're not trained to see it or you don't have the training to see it. So the problem I have with Grievance studies, so of this digging deep, let's say, to find things that are, to use their term, problematic, is that, let's say, their epistemic background, in my view, it's quite, to use their term, problematic itself, because it tells you that the way we view the world has to do not with how we use our mind, but it has to do with our, quote, lived experience. And this is different from saying that, you know what, because let's say you live in a poor neighborhood, you might have more facts. No, it tells you that even if you have all the facts, even if you have read all the books, the way you understand it is still going to be different.
So it seems like they're on these scholars are manufacturing grievances sometimes, or they're on a grievance hunt. Like they already know they're there, they're out looking for them. Onkar, when we talked yesterday, you mentioned this in connection with their kind of larger view of the capitalist system. They know it's problematic, so there's problems, and that means we just have to find them. Could you recapture that?
So in your question, you put it either manufacturing grievances or hunting for grievances. And I think the first is the essential, that it's manufacturing for grievances. There's some hunting for it, but that's not the essential. And I'll explain why I think that. You could put it as there's a long-standing intellectual animus against capitalism. But part of what I think happens with the new left, it becomes much more open, that it's not just against capitalism, it's against the Enlightenment and against Western civilization, really, in the end. So that you're manufacturing grievances, what you're manufacturing is real or, alleged or sometimes real. And part of the way it works is there's some real injustices that they're bringing up. It's not as though the history of the West from the Enlightenment on is just one giant positive, though it's essentially a positive. It's a positive in that we've made massive progress, that we live in today in a state of the world that is, there's never been so many people living so well for so long. So the amount of people on the earth, their standard of living and their life expectancy is at the highest it's ever been. And that's an achievement of the Enlightenment and of the United States of America as the country of the Enlightenment. So it's essentially positive, but there have been some real injustices, like slavery, for instance, in the US. And if people whitewash those, you open the door to people who want to bash America and the Enlightenment and Western civilization. But if your motivation really is to bash these things, then you're not just going to use real injustices, because the arc is we're getting better in a definite way. So it's going to be, you're going to manufacture things that are, you're going to say, like, look at this, look at that, and they're not true. And that's certainly for the history of capitalism, if you know the debates about it, all kinds of things about it creates monopolies and so on, are just not true. And that's part of what is going on here. And I think that's particularly what Boghossian is responding to, that they don't seem to actually care if what they're saying is true, as long as it's a grievance that you can, and this is what I'm at it, that you can use to bash capitalism, enlightenment, and Western civilization on the head with, then it's okay.
Yeah, so let's talk about this attitude towards truth a little bit. The campus procedures that Boghossian was subjected to, one of the things he remarks about them is that they seem to have, they're kangaroo courts. They know the conclusion before the investigation. And there's Nikos, we were talking earlier, you kind of had a thought about the relationship between their espoused ideas on truth and then how they practice their research, and then how the ones of them who go into the administration practice investigating troublesome faculty.
So what we call kangaroo court procedures. So for people who don't know, for example, if a student makes a complaint, as it happened with Boghossian, what happens is not like a court where they tell you, look, that person made this accusation and you face each other, you give your arguments, they give their arguments, and there's, let's say, an arbitration process, who is right, who is wrong. No, it's a very difficult, a very different procedure. And this procedure is a cautionary tale, in my view, what is going to happen if these views then spill out to society. So what the critical legal studies which have influenced these procedures, what they claim is that what you people call, quote, objectivity is actually a system of power. This idea that we hear what you say and we hear what you say, this is a structure of oppression that historically it has been used to subjugate, let's say, victimized groups. Therefore, what we need to do is we need to give more voice to the victim. But notice, not give more voice to the victim so that we find the truth, but we in a way, we affirm the feelings, or we affirm the position of the victim as victim, particularly if it is as one of these, quote, protected groups. Therefore, if this process spills out to real life, we will see things such as the further deterioration of the idea of an objective law. And we see this already in the UK, where if you see the language behind, for example, some hate speech laws, it's not that what you said was, for example, objectively racist. It is that it was perceived by the victim as racist. So it's this idea that we put the victim in the center, but again, not as a tool to better find the truth. Because it would make sense, for example, to say, okay, look, we don't need to brush off to dismiss so easily, let's say, sexual abuse allegations. We need to develop them further. But the difference is that do we examine them further so as to reach the truth, or are we in a mindset, in a philosophy where the mere idea of truth as one and objective and universal is dismissed, and therefore the process we are examining is, okay, who is above whom in this, let's say, in this structure of hierarchies, and therefore who has priority in terms of whose truth should rise above and whose truth should be, let's say, sanctioned with justice. That's why I think it's very interesting to follow how this process of, let's say, delivering justice in universities work. It's very, very worrying, and it's something that should be criticized because it has to be at least contained in universities and not be expanded to the rest of society.
So you mentioned the hate crime laws in the UK. In the US, we have on college campuses, we have Title IX investigations, which seem to follow similar patterns in that there's a deterioration of due process. The fact-finding part of the Title IX investigations seems ungenuine. It was a Title IX investigation that Boghossian faced over the allegations that he harmed his family. That seems to be something that's changed in the last decade that might be part of the explanation of what's changed on college campuses. Onkar, do you have any sense of where Title IX fits into this shift, into this, let's say, ramping up of some of the trends we've known about?
Yeah, I think it's more a symptom than a cause, but in all these kinds of issues, things are often both. So and this is part of what Nikos was talking about, that this is the way they think about so-called justice, that it's not really a quest for the truth. Objectivity is impossible. We're going to elevate a victim just because they say they're a victim, not the issue of are they actually a victim, and so is not front and center. So that way of thinking will then color their approach to all kinds of things, including like when we've got controversies on campus and alleged injustice and so on. How do we deal with them? This is the process we deal. And if you get a law like Title IX, it's in part coming from this kind of view, but now gives them, in effect, a weapon to use against people, and it accelerates the process. So it's coming from somewhere, but it has a causal significance. It's not just a symptom. It also has causal significance. So I think, yeah, with Title IX, the atmosphere on college campus is worse, and in part because of Title IX, and in part because the ideas that were already on campus led to things like Title IX. And it tells you part of the motivation involved. So I mean, we're talking about Boghossian's, in part, his resignation letter. We don't know what happened on Portland State University. I don't know I certainly can believe he was under a Title IX investigation. I think there's enough information out that that's true. What exactly happened in this investigation, I don't know. But when you both look at the law and then look at stories and what has been reported across universities in the US, it is used in a deliberately non-objective way. And part of what that tells you is the concern for victims is not a real concern. That it's to be concerned in a genuine sense with victims is to be concerned with anyone and everyone who's subject to injustice. And in this kind of proceedings, if you have already decided that the person bringing a complaint is the victim, and that what happened didn't happen, you're creating victims. The professor who has to go through this and can't really defend himself, and then there's kind of a black mark. Even if nothing happens, there's kind of this question, like, he was subject to a Title IX investigation. Like, what did he do? And even if they couldn't prove it, and you have this black mark on you, and often it's far worse than that there's real repercussions to these, and you've created a victim. So the idea that you're not these kinds of processes, to say they're non-objective, they're obviously non-objective, and that tells you that the concern, that what's driving it is they care about victims. That's not what they care about.
Okay, so I want to shift slightly to talk about some of let's say the deeper causes of the current climate. So we've mentioned grievance studies, and Nikos was talking about critical theory and the impact that's had on how administrators are running campuses. But the question then is, well, how did this ideology take over? How did these people get into positions of power within campuses? And as Boghossian explains it, his explanation is a little conspiratorial, I think. So he talks about what he calls idea laundering. If you have a certain, you want to study a certain perspective on colonialism, what you do is you start a journal, and then you and your friends who think the same way publish in it. And if you publish it in it enough, you have enough publications for tenure, and now you're a tenured faculty, and this multiplies, and eventually they take over the university system. But that seems to me to not make enough of the ideological preconditions that allows one group to succeed at this versus another. So Onkar, when we talked earlier, you mentioned that if you don't really understand the full cause, there's a kind of, this situation might look a little scary, conspiracist. And this is for Nikos or Onkar, what do you think is the deeper cause of this takeover? Is it just, they were clever in their bureaucratic maneuvering, or was there some kind of inevitability to this?
So definitely it's not that it was a conspiracy, because if it was a conspiracy, it would leave some traces, and we don't have these traces. Also, many people have tried to take over universities. If you think, openly, the Mont Pelerin Society and Hayek, his big idea is we're going to win the battle through the universities. And this failed so miserably that today we know by name the 4 or 5 universities in the West that teach free market ideas. So it's not that. It is that what we'd call this family, let's say, of critical theory, all that stuff, they cast in 2 tendencies that were already very prevalent in the West. The one is epistemological, the idea of particularism. And you could say, but wait a minute, wasn't Marxism that was the dominant paradigm? And Marxism talked about universalism. But Marx also talked about that the way you view the world as a worker is not the same as the way you view the world as a boss. And he talked about class consciousness and bourgeois consciousness and working class consciousness. By the way, he didn't say that the one is right and the other is wrong. He just said that you view the world in 2 different ways. So based on this, then the new left starts elaborating on this. It says, wait a minute, but also this means that, for example, there's a black consciousness and a female consciousness, or let's say a post-colonial consciousness. Therefore, the ground was already fertile for this. But the most important thing, the most important basis for this was egalitarianism. Because what is the point of this movement? The point is we find these injustices and we tear down privilege, we tear down hegemonies. So everyone was in favor of, yes, I understand that there are different systems of knowledge, and everyone was in favor, sure, this is an unjust world, therefore we have to reach some level of justice. You cannot argue against that. So this is a very, very simplistic way to put it, but I think this is why they achieved. And this is why, for example, a quote conspiracy to take over the universities and suddenly teach that, no, you know what? You're a free person, you're an individual, you should be free to try and fail. And if you do better than someone else, that's good for you. That would be so against the dominant moral paradigm out there, which wouldn't have any chance of serious success. So that's a very, very simplistic answer. But if I had to explain it in 3 minutes, I think this is why they became so successful, because there was already a fertile ground in terms of the dominant ideas that they were tweaked a bit, and that's how we ended up where we are today.
Onkar, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, so I agree that it's not a conspiracy, because it was partly because it was more out in the open. And what makes it seem, if you listen to Boghossian and Weiss's podcast, what makes it seem like the explanation is these people got together and in the back rooms they concocted this thing, and they kind of nobody noticed them taking over the administrations and creating these departments. But creating these departments, creating these journals, like it's out in the open, anybody could see it, and that more of them are getting on the administration. People can see. So in that sense, it can't be a conspiracy like that. But it seems like it because they're not talking sufficiently of what Nikos was just talking about the ideological conditions that made it possible for these people to succeed and to have so part of the success is that they have very little opposition. I don't think yet the people who sort of kind of card carriers of this ideological perspective, and whether you call it wokeism or give it a different name, I don't think this is the majority of faculties. Majority of professors in the faculties on universities, but it's a vocal minority that has no opposition. And to understand why it has no opposition, take two of the things that Nikos brought up, which I agree, these are fundamental things. I would put the particularism in a different way, but it's the same issue, that it's that objectivity is impossible. And Marx is a version of that. It's that if you belong to a certain class, you see the world and have to see the world in a certain way. So the idea that you could reach the truth, that you could identify independently the nature of reality and what is out there. And so what is true and what you should do, what values you should adopt. No, that's conditioned by the economic class you're in and so on. There were other versions of that in the 19th century that's not so much focused on economic class, but on some other group that you're the member of, that's what dictates how you look at the world. And objectivity as at a philosophical level came to an end with Kant, with Immanuel Kant in the late 18th, 19th century. The essence of what he does is says objectivity is impossible. And if you look at, and I think this is the right way to look at the Enlightenment, that its essence is objectivity is possible. And if we're objective in every area of life, in science, in math, in politics, in morality, in education, we can achieve real values. We can get to the truth and achieve what's good. That's what it's not consistent in regard to that, but that's the essence of the Enlightenment as a new movement. And Kant said that's impossible. And the 19th century then is, okay, if that's impossible, how do we think about the world? And then you get Marx saying, well, we have to think of it as economic classes, that dictates things, but there's all kinds of variants of that. And the variant today is that it's through race, gender, sexuality. That's what dictates a person's views and identity. So it's collectivism in that kind of an epistemological collectivism, and then the egalitarianism. And so one of the, from a philosophical point of view, for the podcast, one of the things between Boghossian and Weiss, one of the things that is frightening about it, just in thinking about the opposition, like I think they're both genuinely trying to oppose wokeism and so on. But near the start of the podcast, it's Boghossian praises John Rawls' The Theory of Justice and said that had a transformative effect on him. And Rawls, if you had to pick one figure for the rise of egalitarianism from the 70s to today, it's John Rawls. And Boghossian can't see that Rawls' ideas lead to this. And that's part of the problem, that you've got these crusaders, and even opponents like Boghossian can't see the ideas on which they're relying, that they're egalitarians. And if you're opposed to them, you have to question egalitarians.
So what I'm getting from you both is the importance of learning these ideas and their predecessors. So in the spring, I believe both of you are co-teaching a course for the OAC on some of these ideas. Do you want to take a minute to tell us about that? What kind of text you'll be reading? What you see the purpose of the course as?
Yeah, so this is a course. So the problem is that there are two categories mostly out there. The category that takes these ideas at face value as a dogma almost, but also the people who oppose them without really understanding them, or understanding them on a very superficial level. So you see her often saying, oh, these people are ideologues, as if this is the problem with them. So this module tries to understand what we call critical theory from its beginning. So the first thing is, what do these people say? So we go back to Marx, and then to the New Left, then to post-structuralism, terms that we use so often, post-structuralism, postmodernism, and yet they're not exactly the same. We're going to talk about Foucault. For many people, Foucault is the biggest villain in this story, and we're going to see if this is the case. Then we're going to move to feminist studies, queer studies, post-colonialism. So we try to, first of all, understand what are these people actually saying. We don't want to strawman them, so we want to see, okay, let's go back to the sources. What are they saying? And the second thing we're trying to do is, what is our criticism to them? And this is the most important and difficult thing. We sense that something is wrong with them. We sense that they are wrong, but how exactly do we refute them? Where exactly, how do we put our finger saying, this is where you're wrong, and this is where you went when you, this is the right way to approach it, and this is why you're missing it. So, Onkar, do you want to say something else about the module?
Yes. So we will also read some things where it's kind of contemporary application of this. And part of looking at the history is just what we were talking about. It's that you need it to really see the history is to see the causality involved. And when you're talking about ideas, it's not deterministic. It's not, okay, there was this idea and then there has to be this idea, but there is logical connections between them. And even if you're talking about ideas that are wrong, or even if you think like they're not just wrong, they're irrational, there's still a logic there to the ideas that, and again, if nobody opposes them, how they develop and what they lead to. And so to take as an example, I mean, we haven't decided exactly the whole reading list and but I think if you read Kendi, How to Be an Anti-Racist, you can't understand it and why it's plausible to people today if you don't see Rawls in the background. And this is the kind of thing that's exactly what Boghossian doesn't. He thinks Boghossian does not see. He seems to think that Rawls is an opponent of Kendi. And I think that's completely wrong. But part of what seeing that connection, it makes the whole phenomenon more intelligible. So to go back to the conspiracy kind of issue, the more it seems like, and if you listen again to that podcast, you get a bit of this. These people are crazy. And at one level, I can understand describing some of these people as crazy, but that's insufficient. You have to there's a certain logic here, and to oppose them, that is to successfully oppose bad ideas, you have to expose them, you have to really understand them and what they're relying on, and you have to oppose everything about that, what they're relying on. And that is the objectivism, because it's a radical new philosophy, gives you a perspective on the way other ideas are working that, I mean, it's just completely absent, I think, for instance, from Boghossian.
And let us also highlight that this class, this module, is open to auditors. So, and I would encourage people to, even if you're not, let's say, a student in OAC, you can audit this class. And this class, the way we envision it, it gives you a map to navigate what is happening out there with the so-called culture wars. So you take this class and suddenly you understand, and you can connect the dots, and you can see where do these things come from, and also where are they going and how they're related to each other, but also how they're different to each other. So for example, I don't like when people say, oh, SJWs are communists. No, if you go back, you see there are big differences. There are significant similarities on some fundamentals, but also there are differences. So anyway, I'm excited about this module, and I think, again, if you're interested in what's happening out there and you follow the so-called culture wars, consider auditing this course.
Great, thank you. Okay, so for the last major topic, I want to talk about what we can do, or what Boghossian thinks he can do to counter these people, to oppose these people. So he, both in the letter and in the podcast he does with Barry Weiss, he doesn't exactly say it this way, but I think one of the things you can take from what he's saying is that in a sense, the wokeism crowd has won. They've taken over academia, and he doesn't see any future for people fighting within the system. He comes and he advocates alternative institutions. So I think we should talk a little bit about what an alternative institution might look like, what Boghossian as an opponent, what we think of that. So let's see. So Onkar, when we talked yesterday, you mentioned the idea of you wanted to connect the possibility of alternative institutions to academia, to the kind of spirit of Silicon Valley, where they don't try to reform something from within, but they have a kind of external alternative to it. And I think, if I remember, your example was Uber did not try to change the taxi industry. Instead, it did an end run around the regulations. So do you want to say anything about that, about the possibility of alternative institutions, what they might look like?
So certainly in the US, there's a growing it's too strong to call it, I was going to say a growing movement, but sort of growing conversations about the need for alternative institutions. And I think in education broadly, so from K-12 education to colleges and universities, that there's more recognition that they're failing in certain ways, or even if you don't put it as they're failing, they're not that good and they could be way better. And part of why I think the comparison to Uber is interesting in terms of thinking about this is that, so the taxi cab industry is similar in a certain sense to the colleges and universities, and also K through 12, in that there's massive government involvement in these from K through 12, that's certainly through public schools, but part of what's changed for universities is the role that government and government money plays in universities today is, if you go now like back decades, is significantly greater. And that is corrupting. And it just as it corrupted the taxi cab industry, and if you you just pay the government for a license and so on, and then you won't have competitors, there's a fixed number of licensees and so on. Did anybody think taxi cabs were great when we just had taxi? No, they're expensive, their drivers are unfriendly, often rude to you and so on. And so when Uber did an end run around them, there were questions about, like, is this even legal to do? The government says only these people can be cabs, can these other people? And people who are now going to try to take on K through 12 and college and university are going to face that kind of issue of like, are we even going to allow this from the government's perspective? But what Uber did was, in effect, come into certain places, offer a service. The government and legal systems are fairly slow. And what they were hoping, and they succeeded in this, was by the time they start to have real challenges, it was enough people are using Uber. This is way better than taxi cabs. We want this. We don't want to go back to taxi cabs. And that is what I think what it will look like in regard to education, that there will be a lot of gray areas. Is this legitimate and so on? But if you get real innovation, which you will, if you get Silicon Valley people and that kind of mentality involved, it will be so much better that people say, no, we're not going back, even if in some sense they violated the law and so on.
And in some ways, it's an even more important disruption than Uber, because, for example, I remember around 2014, many libertarians were so hyped with the sharing economy or with 3D printing. They were saying it's a matter of time to live in a freer world. But if you don't change the ideas, the technology by itself is not going to liberate you. So we even saw the opposite, that some of these, let's say, Silicon Valley, very creative and new businesses, their ideas add up to the mess, to the ideological mess out there. So disrupting education is the number one need, is the number one area that needs to be disrupted, and then disrupting anything else is going to be easier.
Let me say something in follow-up to that. So here the disruption is kind of new institutions, new ways of thinking, new forms of organization that requires at least de facto freedom. So Uber didn't have freedom in law. Like, I think if you, in many of the cities where they went into, if you look at the law, they shouldn't have been there. But they had de facto freedom in the sense that the law didn't descend upon them. And you'll need that in regard to having real innovation in education. But you will also need, if we're talking here that you're going to challenge the ideas that are increasingly entrenched in universities. And again, that doesn't mean everyone agrees with them, but they're the vocal minority that nobody dares challenge. And that has seeped into the business world, the nonprofit world. I mean, the people I talk to, basically everybody in any sizable industry now is dealing with issues of so-called diversity, equity, and inclusion in the US. So it really is all over the place. And to challenge that, it's not just enough to have different institutions. If you have different institutions propagating the same ideas, and particularly, like this is the philosophical perspective, propagating the same philosophical fundamentals that lead to and support this, then the disruption's not going to be like the disruption of Uber, and you got something way better. You might have something a bit better, but if it's still teaching, egalitarianism is right and John Rawls is right and so on, that will be a disaster. And there's another element of this that we haven't talked about, that it's even, there's fewer people who there's very few people who challenge egalitarianism today. Even fewer people challenge determinism. And if you get other institutions than these kind of, I think of them now as government education from K through university, not just K through 12. It's K through university. It's essentially government education or government schools. If you get something in the private sector, but it continues to push determinism, people are, including Boghossian, and if you listen to the podcast that comes up with Weiss, like they're both sort of puzzled. Why are students, do they seem so fragile that they can't listen to arguments, that they find an argument threatening and so on? There's no way, there's no better way to disempower someone, and sort of feeling fragile, out of control, helpless is the flip side of being disempowered. I mean, that's a way of describing it. If you've lost power, that's how you come to feel, that you're helpless. Then telling people you don't have choice, you don't have control of your mind, you're not able to think, you can't determine your own values, you're a product. And it doesn't matter if you're a product of your economic class, you're a product of your biology, you're a product of your ancestry, you're a product of your genes, you're a product of what gender you are, what sex you are. It doesn't matter. If you've told people that you don't have choices and you don't have this kind of volitional control over your own life, that is the most disempowering thing you can do to someone. And that's everywhere. Not just in these race, gender, sexuality journals. It's all over the humanities and all over the sciences. And if you're going to keep that as what we're teaching kids, that they feel that they don't have power, you can't be surprised by it. If you really project what it means to take determinism seriously, it means you're helpless.
And it's also the gateway to tribalism. Because if you tell people you can't make sense of the world and you don't have the capacity to use the tool that would help you to navigate the world, then how do I navigate? I need to cling to other people. I need to link up to other people. It's like we're all blind, but if we hold hands, we might be able to navigate our blindness. And this is this is why tribalism is also so popular today.
So we're running a little low on time. I want to make sure we cover one briefly one last bit, which is that as far as alternative institutions go, this summer, our ARI CEO, Tal Tesfani, announced that the OAC is turning into the Ayn Rand University, an alternative, for now, philosophy program. And this is the subject of next week's podcast, so stay tuned for more. But Onkar, if you wanted to say maybe a minute or two about how you see ARU fitting into this potential for alternatives to academia.
Yes. And there's a similarity to, I think, Boghossian's perspective, though it's not the same, but we at ARI thought, so the ARI was founded in the 80s, so this is like over a certain span of time, that what we need to do is get people into universities, and that you can have change and reform and better ideas winning out but within these institutions. And I think most of us at ARI now are more skeptical that is either, if possible, the best strategy. I think some of us are skeptical that it's even possible, but even if it is in some sense possible, is it the best strategy? And given the world that Silicon Valley has opened up, that all these new possibilities, the thinking is, no, now it's let's create more of our own programming, our own institution, where we do some of the training that would have happened in universities, and so if the universities were good. So so this is the issue of an alternative institution, instead of trying to reform from within existing universities and existing education. So that's the vision, and that you said Tal, our CEO, was articulating in this talk in Ocon a few weeks ago, is just that's the direction. But what's crucial from our perspective is it's not just a different institution or institutional framework. It has radically different ideas that will be the foundation for what we're teaching and what we're doing. And not just in the sense, and this is what's very different than Boghossian. He seems to have this kind of attitude that we need to get back to liberal, the liberal university, when the humanities were liberal. And our perspective on that, and particularly if you don't mean classical liberal, which I don't think is exactly what is meant when he uses liberal, is no, all kinds of those ideas are really, really wrong and lead to where we are now. So, and Rawls is again an example of that. Like, he'll be put in the liberal tradition, and our perspective on his whole viewpoint and the egalitarians more generally as they're enemies, and not just like they're wrong, they're enemies of freedom, of reason, of the enlightenment, of objectivity. So part of what will be different about our institution is not just, well, it's an alternative institution. It has radically alternative ideas.
Okay, great. Let's take a few of the super chat questions before we log off. Mary Eileen asked a number of questions. I think we answered her question about any hope in academia. She asks, what's the name of your course, Nikos and Onkar? Do you have a name for the course yet?
Okay, that's going to be counterclimactic. We haven't got a name. But it's probably going to be something related to, so if you see it in the curriculum, you'll recognize it. It's going to be something related to critical theory, because it's probably the theme that puts these fields together. But I don't know, Onkar, have you got any thoughts on the name?
Yeah, I mean, it has a working title, kind of investigating critical theory or something like that. I think there's something up on the OAC site about it, but we might come up with a catchier name closer to
catchier title.
But you'll know it when you see it.
From Zoom, we have the question, is it possible to sign up just as an auditor for just your course? And I think the answer to that is or will be yes.
Yes.
Let's see.
I think there's discounts if people sign up for more, but it certainly will be possible to just do that.
Possible to do just one. Yeah. Have either of you read Cynical Theories by James Lindsay and Helen Pluckrose? This is a question also from Mary Eileen. And do you have any thoughts? Pluckrose and Lindsay were the collaborators with Boghossian on the hoax papers.
So I use Cynical Theories not to deconstruct these theories, but also to teach them. So they did a very good work in finding the essence, and putting these ideas out in a simple way. Now, I might disagree on their solutions that they offer, but it's a very good book as a beginning to try to understand these ideas. So trying to say in simple words what Derrida is about is very difficult, and I think they're doing a good work in it.
Okay. How much of the current trends in universities is derived from the philosophy of postmodernism? I mentioned that briefly, but
in its essence, a lot. As a school of thought, not so much. So if you go in a humanities department, say how many of you are postmodernists, you're not going to see many hands raised. But in terms of its influence, I would say it has been an influence, but it's not the dominant thing anymore. Critical race theory or intersectionality, I would say, are way more dominant. Although you could say they have common roots with postmodernism, but postmodernism was also, let's say, a paradigm which is it's not the most fashionable thing anymore, although we use these terms often interchangeably. More on that on the course. What's the difference between postmodernism and critical race theory?
I think we have.
I'll just say one other thing in terms of thinking about this kind of thing. One of the things Ayn Rand /objectivism teaches you in regard to thinking about these kinds of issues is to not divorce the psychology from looking at these kinds of issues. So if you ask, is it the same mentality as like that there were people who were part of the old left and now part of the new left who used to view themselves as postmodern and now have latched on to something else? And so I think the answer often is yes, it's the same mentality. But that doesn't mean it's just, you can say like the content of what they're saying now is just a glossed over version of Marxism or something like that. And that you have to distinguish those two, but see the relationship of those two. And that's part of how to look at these movements.
Okay, I think we have time for just one more quick one before we have to sign off. This question's about, well, it mentions Boghossian's book, A Manual for Creating Atheists. I haven't read that, if either of you. No.
I have not.
So let's, but he brings up the book because he wants to know about Boghossian's skepticism. So he says he drove people skeptical from their religion, but provided no thorough epistemology, I guess no alternative. Is that a failing on his part? To what, let's say, in what ways is Boghossian's skepticism of certainty undermining his cause?
Onkar.
Yeah, so I'm not an expert on Boghossian, but the wider phenomenon is what I think is actually interesting, or is more interesting. If I had to pick, do you want to know exactly what Boghossian's view is, or how this is working culturally? And so, and this comes up in the podcast that he viewed himself as he really got into being vocal about an atheist with the rise of the new atheist or like the cultural cachet that the new atheist had, whatever, in 2003 going forward for a number of years. And people like Dawkins and so on have spoken out about his mistreatment by university and so on. When it's said that they don't offer anything positive epistemologically, I don't think that's right. That is too strong. They're at least the best of them, or pro-science. So someone like Dawkins is pro-science, a Sam Harris is pro-science, a Dennett is pro-science. And I think Boghossian would think of himself as he's pro-reason, he's pro-enlightenment, he's pro-science. And there's all kinds of things, those science and the Enlightenment and the scientific method have taught us about proper epistemology, the search for the truth. But it's not sufficient. It's not a complete case. And particularly when you get to the philosophical level, and how does all this work? And why do we even think we're aware of the world external to us? And can you really defend that? Or is that just an article of faith for you? And so when you get to the philosophical questions about this, I think many of them they're not able to answer. I think Boghossian would be aware of what they are. Some of these people, I think they're not even quite aware of what the controversies are and what happened philosophically, what Kant did in the way in which he saves science by relegating it to, it doesn't tell you anything about reality. So they're not just that sophisticated. Boghossian's in philosophy, as is Dennett, so they should know some of this, versus a Richard Dawkins, who's a biologist. But so there are epistemological problems, but it's too strong to say they don't have anything positive to say. But what there also is, like if I was thinking about this in terms of what the questioner is bringing up, what they're unable to do is how to give a convincing perspective on how to think about values. And some of them are trying to do this, how to think about values, morality, from a more scientific perspective. But there's major things wrong in the way they think about that. And this is in part, why did the Enlightenment intellectually come to an end? It's because nobody could offer an integrated perspective of how to think about facts and values, about what's true and what's good. And part of the way what Kant did works is, I'll give you truth if you give me values. And it's, yeah, your science gets to truth. That's about a phenomenal world, the world of appearances, not true reality. True reality is about our commitments and values. And so, and that is, you get to that by a very different way. It's total mysticism in Kant, but there's that split has never been healed. And these people are unable to do it even when they try to do it. And this is one of Ayn Rand's major achievements philosophically, is how to think about fact and values and to integrate them, not to split them into two separate realms. It's one of her major philosophical achievements.
Okay, thank you to everyone who sent us a question and for your super chat donations. If you have follow-up questions or think we missed the essence of your question, you can join us on Clubhouse afterwards. Thank you, Nikos and Onkar, for being here with me today. Like I was saying, we'll continue the conversation in just a few minutes on the Clubhouse app. We are the Ayn Rand Club. You can just search for us in the app if you're new to it. Next week on New Ideal Live, we'll be talking about the expansion of the Ayn Rand University. I know Onkar will be involved in that discussion, so I think some of the things we talked about at the end of today's podcast will come back up. On October 13th, there will be another general Q&A on objectivism that will be run by Ben Bayer and one of our junior fellows, Dr. Tristan Delige, who will be appearing on New Ideal for the first time. If you have questions about objectivism that you'd like Ben and Tristan to answer, you can email newideal@aynrand.org. Send us your questions. We'll try to get to as many as we can. You can follow New Ideal Live on YouTube by clicking subscribe and hitting the bell notification. Please like our video if you like it. It helps us get more views and it helps with the algorithm. And you can also follow us on Facebook. And again, please like, as it helps with the algorithms. Thanks again, Onkar. Thanks again, Nikos. That's it for today. We'll see you next time. Bye-bye.
Thanks.